Today we're diving into a source that makes a really provocative claim, that the Isa of the Quran and the Jesus of the New Testament, well, that they aren't the same person at all. It's a huge argument for sure, with some massive implications. So let's just walk through the evidence it presents, step by step. And really, this is the question that's at the heart of it all. You know, for billions of people, both Muslims and Christians, the names Jesus and Isa are pretty much used interchangeably. But the source we're digging into today says, hang on, that's a huge mistake. It claims the sacred texts themselves paint a picture of two figures who just can't be reconciled. So here's our roadmap for breaking down this argument. We're going to start with the core thesis, then we'll look at the historical record it brings up. After that, we'll get into the single biggest point of conflict, the crucifixion, before comparing their missions, and we'll wrap it all up with what the source calls a critical, logical flaw. Okay, let's get right into it. Part 1, the core argument. The source doesn't waste any time. It basically asserts that we're not just looking at different interpretations of the same person, we're talking about two completely separate identities. And there it is. This is the central claim. In the source's own words, it's incredibly blunt, right? It's meant to draw a really sharp line in the sand. The argument is basically this. One is a character in a theological story, and the other is a figure of actual, verifiable history. Every other point we're about to cover is designed to build this case. So, where does the source even begin to make a case like that? Well, it starts with the historical record. The whole argument here really hinges on the type of evidence we have for each figure. Okay, so this slide lays out the source's first big contrast. On the one hand, you have events from the Quran, describing Isa speaking right from the cradle, creating birds out of clay. On the other hand, it lists all these historical sources from that era that mention Jesus. So what the source is getting at here is pretty clear. One account sounds like a mythic tale, while the other seems to be grounded in historical documentation. Next up, we get to what the source basically calls the ultimate breaking point between these two narratives, the crucifixion. And it frames this as not just a difference in belief, but a head-on collision with the historical record. First, the source presents the Islamic position, pulling directly from the Quran. This verse is absolutely central to the Islamic understanding of Isa's life. It states very clearly that he was not crucified. It's a foundational belief. And then right after that, the source hits back with its rebuttal. It argues that the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most widely accepted facts in ancient history, something that the vast majority of scholars, no matter their faith, agree on. So from this source's perspective, to deny the crucifixion is to deny history itself. And to really hammer this historical claim home, the source points to what happened next. It highlights a passage from the New Testament that talks about over 500 eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus. The point of using a number like this is to frame the event not as some secret story, but as a public claim backed up by a huge number of witnesses, directly contradicting the narrative that it never even happened. Okay, so moving beyond historical events, the source argues that their whole purpose, their mission on Earth, is just fundamentally different. Let's take a look at how it contrasts their core claims.
Man, this slide really breaks it down, doesn't it? It shows Isa's mission as being all about reinforcing the core ideas of Islam, worship one God, deny his own divinity, and act as a forerunner to Muhammad. But then, in sharp contrast, it presents Jesus as making claims that, especially in that Jewish context, were understood as divine, forgiving sins, accepting worship, and even using the divine name I Am.
And that really brings us to the source's bottom line on this point. A distinction it presents as totally black and white. One is a servant of God, the other claims to be God. According to this text, you just can't be both. All right, let's get to the final argument. This is the one the source frames as a kind of logical paradox inside the Quran itself. It's presented as the big finale, the point that tries to use the Quran's own words to challenge its story about Isa.
So here's how the source lays out this so-called paradox. First, it points to verses in the Quran that praise Jesus' apostles, calling them true and victorious. Okay. Second, it states that these very same apostles are the ones who wrote the New Testament. Third, as we've already seen, the Jesus of the New Testament is completely different from the Isa of the Quran. So the source presents a dilemma. If the Quran says the apostles are true, then their writings must be true, which, in the source's view, means the Quran's own story about Isa must be false. It's framed as a kind of logical checkmate.
So let's just pull all these threads together real quick. The source has drawn a series of really sharp contrasts, right? It's historical records versus what it calls a mythological narrative. It's a crucifixion it says is a historical fact versus a theological denial. It's a figure claiming divinity versus a prophet who points to another.
And finally, a text it claims is historically consistent versus one it argues contradicts itself.
And so the source leaves us with this final, really challenging question. When a historical account and a theological one seem to tell two completely different stories about the same person, which one gets to define reality? It's a deep question, and it's the one that sits right at the very heart of this entire debate.